Good morning, everybody. This is a really special day. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here. This is the Lana Staheli Endowed Lectureship, and there's a little bit of information up on the board behind me about Lana, who endowed this lectureship, and it's been happening since, I believe, 2009. And so here's some of the examples of the past awesome lectures that she has sponsored for us, and today included. And so now I have the great pleasure of introducing Dr. Elisa Troyer, who's a family physician living in Tucson, Arizona, and working as a locum tenens in rural Colorado, where she provides outpatient and inpatient care for adults and children, as well as surgical obstetrics. She has found that this model of work has given her bandwidth for more of the things she loves: volunteering at a free clinic, performing medical evaluations for asylum seekers, working with a local search and rescue organization, and engaging in her new interest at the intersection of climate change, migration, and health. In her free time, she's probably outside somewhere, though she might be adding an occasional post to her amateur blog, a sense of impending bloom. Dr. Troyer believes that storytelling can help us feel less alone in this wild world, and when we share with each other, we see possibilities of what it can look like to live our lives more joyfully and in alignment with our true selves. Very well said and well timed. Welcome, Dr. Troyer.
Thank you all for being here. So I'm actually going to start with a video here that I feel serves kind of as a metaphor for many different aspects of life, that I've used it to describe what it's like to guide medical students and residents, or keeping track of all the documentation and communication that goes into patient care. And relevant to this lecture, I would say that it also sort of depicts our attempt to control our work and home lives with all the commitments and people involved.
This man right here is my great-grandfather. He was the first cat herder in our family.
Herding cats, don't let anybody tell you it's easy. Anybody can herd cattle. Holding together 10,000 half-wild short hairs, well, that's another thing altogether.
Being a cat herder is probably about the toughest thing I think I've ever done.
I got this one this morning, right here, and if you look at his face, it's just ripped to shreds, you know?
You see the movies, you hear the stories, I'm living a dream. Not everyone can do what we do.
I wouldn't do nothing else.
It ain't an easy job, but when you bring a herd into town and you ain't lost a one of them, ain't a feeling like it in the world.
So I'm not actually sure what that company is. I don't think that it exists anymore, but its legacy has still lived on. Does anyone recognize that commercial? Anyone? So this was actually from the Super Bowl in 2000, so almost 25 years ago. Oh my God. This is Super Bowl 34. St. Louis Rams versus the Tennessee Titans, and I had to look that up. I did not actually, I just came for the cats. But can anyone else see themselves in this video? Were you the one rolling the yarn, or fording the river with the cats tucked under the armpits, or trying to coax a bunch of cats down off a tree while you were precariously perched on someone else's shoulders? But the teamwork, the passion, the pride, man, a bit inspiring. Ain't a feeling like it in the world. Well, thank you for taking time out of your busy days to join me. And I want to acknowledge that I know that Dr. Brunner would be here today. I know this is something that she deeply is passionate about, and that this lecture series is really special to her, and that she would be with us in spirit. To start today, through sharing stories this morning, we will be illustrating how each person's ideal work-life balance will look unique to themselves and to their stage of life, and that if we truly want to design a system that supports people, we have to take that into account. We will be exploring how our deepest values can offer direction when we're feeling a bit rudderless. And then we're going to challenge the idea that past decisions unalterably prescribe the future, and that's for ourselves as individuals and for organizations. You may be wondering what a family doctor from Arizona is even doing here in Seattle Children's. And that is because Cora found me, or Dr. Brunner found me over the summer when I submitted an essay for a Women in Medicine contest on Doximity, which is an online social media platform for healthcare professionals. The prompt was to write about failure, and perhaps ironically, I felt like I had failed so spectacularly that there was no way anyone could beat me at this. I did end up winning, which was validating, I guess. And this was the beautiful artwork that accompanied my essay on its published webpage. The response to the essay really astounded me, as hundreds of people commented or upvoted the essay and reached out to me specifically by email or different messages saying that they felt so seen and to thank me for sharing my story. It truly must have struck a chord, and that's when Dr. Brunner invited me here to share some of my story here at the Lana Staheli Work-Life Balance Lecture Series. We'll get to my story, but first, a word about work-life balance. Unless you have been living under a rock or are truly just now emerging into the healthcare world, you will probably have completed various modules about how work-life balance is so important to have in our lives, and attended various meetings about this. And if you're anything like me, maybe you've rolled your eyes a little bit, or even gotten a little annoyed that rather than actually taking care of myself, I was watching these presentations. Yes, sleep is crucial. Let me go give myself dementia while I pull my 24-hour shift. And yes, having hobbies and extracurricular activities help us feel like balanced and complete human beings. Let me figure out where to fit in those commitments outside of work and home while I'm staying up until midnight finishing my notes. This year, the AMA National Physician Comparison Report showed that the rate or the percentage of people that experience work-life burnout actually decreased to an apparent 48% last year in 2023 from 62.8% in 2021. This was interesting to me, and of note, it stated that about 12,400 physicians participated in this survey, and if a quick Google search is done, then you find that about 989,000 physicians are here in the U.S. today, and that includes MDs, DOs, and IMGs. So not necessarily a great representative sample, and when I talk with my friends that are still working and functioning, I would say far more than half of them are saying that they can't do this anymore. That when they say, I'm functioning, this is what they look like. I think that most of us, despite whatever statistics are put out, know that we're still in a bad way. And rather than starting with numbers or trying to figure out who exactly is right, we can just start with the assumption that we have heard and probably are living some of the depressing data and go from there. So a little about me. I was one of those students that actually really loved medical school. Sure, as for most of us mortals, it was a bit overwhelming at times, but the camaraderie and the sense that I was pursuing a calling kept me going, as I suspect it did for many of us. It is interesting how our sense of calling, even in the middle of school, can change. I entered as a dual degree MD/MPH student because I loved big systems thinking. And I thought I didn't want to do that anymore, and here I am talking about work-life balance, so it's kind of interesting how our lives don't necessarily go in a straight line. But in school, I continued to explore all the different specialties and finally settled on family medicine, mostly because while I loved all of my clinical rotations, I knew that I didn't want to spend most of my life in the OR, or only with women, or only with children for the rest of my life, although obviously children are delightful. In my last year of medical school, I learned that family physicians, sort of like those from the 1960s or 70s, still existed. And not only that, there were residencies that were still training new doctors to function that way. Variety, adrenaline, all the types of patients in all the settings. I knew what I wanted to do next. My dream job. Womb to tomb medicine, as they say. I matched into my first choice at North Colorado Family Medicine in Greeley, Colorado, and this is an unopposed residency, meaning that we were the only residents in the hospital. In addition to our clinic training, we managed the OB and PEDS floors, along with our adult medicine service. It was excellent training and intense. We had quite a lot of autonomy and responsibility, but as interns often find, that responsibility isn't necessarily accompanied by the social capital that it takes to get things done in a hospital. This was exemplified in a case overnight in the ICU as I was charged with caring for a very sick 27-year-old with hypertriglyceridemic pancreatitis. He did survive, but without going into all the details, who takes an intern seriously when she says that she thinks a patient might be dying? After an intense night of feeling incredibly helpless, all of that got compounded by underlying exhaustion and depression and a cold and dark Colorado winter, and I began to spiral. The scary part was that no one had any idea. This was me in the middle, the very night block that I had become very, very ill. And I was still doing excellent work. I still looked like my happy, jokey self. No one had any idea that beneath that smiling exterior, I was questioning everything about my life. If no one would listen to me when I said a patient needed something, how could I even be a doctor? And if I weren't a doctor, what even was the point of all of this? I will be eternally grateful to my senior who, after hearing an apparently suspicious comment, expressed her concern about my well-being to a faculty member. And I will also be eternally grateful for my advisor and another attending that guided me to the help that I needed to recover. It was a long road and one that I never, ever would have wanted for myself. But I am who I am now because of what I went through. And I am grateful for that. My therapist helped me identify some of the signs, sort of like canaries in the coal mine, if you've heard of that analogy. Early indicators that my mental health was in a downturn. And so in the future, I would know that something was out of balance in my life and I could address it before it was really bad. I took these signs seriously and swore to myself that I would never, ever again let myself become that sick, and certainly not on account of a job. Despite all of this, I finished residency on a high note, all things considered, especially since we were in the middle of a COVID pandemic. And I had been able to turn that low point of intern year into a way of connecting with other struggling residents, helping them feel less alone, and often lowering the stigma of seeking therapy. I could see how my skills, especially in emergent situations, had developed. One of the house supervisors would tell me that when he saw a PEDS asthma patient getting transferred to Denver, that he could breathe a sigh of relief when he got there and saw that I was managing it. And that was one of the greatest compliments that I think demonstrated how I had grown over the last few years. Not only was I proud of the doctor that I had become, I was proud of the person that I had grown to be as well. I graduated in 2020, a rather tumultuous year to be released into the world as a fresh attending, to be sure. But I was still excited to start my work as a full-time, full-spectrum family medicine doctor, doing work in rural Arizona, womb-to-tomb medicine, my dream job, and everything that I had trained to do. Caring for adults and kids in outpatient and inpatient settings, delivering babies, and I knew that I was joining an incredible team of physicians. My coworkers were collegial and personable, and we regularly shared our own lives with each other and consulted each other on perplexing patient cases. And I never had any doubt that in the middle of the night, someone would come assist with a C-section or help resuscitate a baby while we were waiting for the NICU flight team to land. I love my coworkers, and I genuinely felt that they loved me. But the adrenaline wore off after about 18 months, around the time that we were experiencing another COVID wave, fueled in part by the vaccine hesitancy of the community. The intensity of the practice was starting to sink in, and I slept very poorly on call nights, regardless of whether I got called in to deliver a baby. And I felt sluggish with a full clinic load the next day. I had, in the past, taken great pride in my ability to empathetically respond to patient concerns, but I really struggled to do this in 15-minute visits, especially when I was so tired. Weekends, when not charting, were spent hiking alone, desperately trying to recharge my social batteries that my work drained completely. And as a very introverted person, I would arrive home after a day of constantly talking and have no remaining energy to connect with anyone, not even my partner. I began to see patients as inconveniences. How dare they be sick? And I knew that my canaries in the coal mine were indicating danger, danger, danger. I enrolled myself in a group coaching program, learning tips for clinic flow and how to shift my thoughts about my work. I optimized my EMR use to the point that I left most non-call days 30 minutes after the last patient, with inboxes empty and all notes done. I rejoiced. This is it. This will finally fix my problem. And if you believe that chart work is the main cause of burnout in today's world, then you might think I'd be scot-free. However, I soon felt that even though my free time had increased, this introvert was still too socially exhausted to actually create any sense of community after seeing so many patients each day. It isn't different anywhere else, people told me, and as I browsed job listings, I found that they were mostly right. The comment that hurt the worst, though, was this: if you leave, you're the reason that the healthcare system is collapsing and there aren't enough doctors. I spent months processing this statement and releasing the sense of responsibility as a single person causing these dire circumstances. However, the guilt that I felt about leaving my dream job ultimately wasn't enough to overcome the need to save myself. I felt that I clearly wasn't cut out for this. I basically just started, and I have already failed at the US healthcare system. And so, almost a year ago now, after investing over a decade of my life to get here, I left my dream job with its incredible people. And if experiencing an existential crisis weren't enough, my partner and I also split, and I had to make the heartbreaking decision to euthanize my 17-year-old cat. It was a rough time. It felt like my life had been burned to the ground, and I would have to start over from scratch as a single woman without kids in her mid-30s, a state in which many society would consider to be failure all by itself. Who am I, and why am I here indeed? What now? What do I even do? I felt completely lost and rudderless. And while I didn't exactly go on a full eat, pray, love spree, I did decide to walk the Camino de Santiago across northern Spain this year, along the 550-mile Camino Frances route that starts in, and I do not speak French, so don't judge me, Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port in France, and then all the way across to Finisterre on the Atlantic Ocean. Although along the way, I suppose I did do a lot of eating and praying and loving, so to speak. Many people walk the Camino as they navigate some sort of crisis, so I was in excellent company. I had a great deal of time to grieve, to regroup, to truly evaluate what my deepest values were, and that maybe my dream life, and therefore my dream job, had changed since I was in medical school 12 years ago. And maybe that was okay. To consider that maybe there was more than one way that I could be a doctor. And maybe there was a better way to integrate my values of joy and curiosity, love, integrity, and simplicity. And that as long as I held those values as a compass, I couldn't make too horrible of a decision for my next step. And maybe this wasn't the end of my career in medicine, just another iteration. When I got home from the Camino, I began experimenting with removing myself as much as possible as a commodity in the system. I am giving away my skills at a free clinic, performing medical evaluations for asylum seekers, and got started working with a local search and rescue organization. I work as locum tenens about 1 week a month to pay the bills. I still have plenty of student loans. And during my first shift, I wept with gratitude at the realization that I do still love the practice of medicine. That it wasn't all this $350,000 mistake and a decade of my life wasted. This portfolio career may not be what I do forever, and that's okay, because I am having an incredible time indulging in my curiosity. And just as important to me, I am not waiting to do the things that I love until I retire. I am integrating them into my life right now. I saw close up how fragile life is during the COVID pandemic, as random healthy people would suddenly and inexplicably develop strange long COVID symptoms and could no longer live their normal lives. And in April 2020, the height of the craziness, my father was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and was in the hospital for almost a month after a complicated recovery from a Whipple. He is, amazingly, still with us today and somehow considered cancer-free, but he is still very weak compared to what this former construction worker thought he was going to be able to, be living his 60s as. And I realized that nothing is guaranteed, and I wanted to experience my life now, not wait until I hopefully retired someday and still had my health. And I'm doing that. I get to spend time with the people that I care about, like eating meals with my neighbors and taking my mom on a hike in Arches National Park that she probably wouldn't have gone on with anyone else. I'm experiencing the seasons and cooking and hiking and connecting and watching the quails in my backyard in the morning and all the things I do when I know that I'm healthy. And I'm doing it while I still feel fulfilled in my work, giving back to the world. The process of building my life from the ground up, but with skills and experience and a deeper knowledge of myself, has been such a gift. I have been able to intentionally consider whether to integrate something new into my life, whether it fits into my core values that I want to live by. I recognize that this isn't something that everyone gets to do, at least in as much of an extreme way. And I intend not to take that for granted. I wasn't cut out for what I believed my dream job was, and I found out that's actually okay. So what now? What does this mean for us and our healthcare system? After telling my story, do I think that everyone should just give up and quit their jobs? Is it all that hopeless? I don't think so, but I do think that it is going to be more complicated than optimizing an EMR or suggesting that we build resilience or be more mindful during our 15-minute clinic visits, sometimes double booked, sometimes with an interpreter and trying to meet quality metrics and completing prior authorizations and fielding my chart messages, requesting antibiotics for 2 days of a runny nose. Anyone get those messages? But how can we cultivate a sense of fulfillment like those cat herders seem to have, while still acknowledging the intensity of our jobs? What is work-life balance anyway? There's constant dialogue around the ideal terminology to use when we're talking about this subject. There are some voices in this sphere that feel the term balance creates a picture of two or more opposing forces that must compete always for attention and time. And if understood this way, we will always be fighting to fend off the encroachment of one upon the other. In other words, in many ways, balance feels like an impossible goal. Another depiction that has been put forth of what we can be working toward is work-life integration, as depicted in this image here from Dr. Heather Logge et al. In their 2018 article, Work-Life Integration, Being Whole at Work and at Home. They argue that in order to be successful, most surgeons find themselves accomplishing some work tasks at home and tending to some life responsibilities while at work, i.e. work-life integration. And that rather than filtering essential parts of one's life identity while at work, work-life integration allows us to come to work whole. This seems to work for some people and has been shown to increase, when we are approaching this way, has been shown to increase a sense of well-being. And it's also fascinating to me how beautiful it is that each of us is different, because work-life integration doesn't honestly really click with what I want. I like to be completely present wherever I am to the fullest extent of my capabilities. And checking on patients while at home when I'm trying to be present with my loved ones doesn't quite allow me to do that. A practical example in my life was while I was taking call from home at my job in Arizona. It was over the weekend, and while theoretically, even though it was a pretty smooth morning, my partner at the time said the Q word, and I knew it would all fall apart. But he had spent the afternoon cooking and even plated out all this beautiful food. And I got a phone call just as we were sitting down that a multip had rolled in, was 8 centimeters with a bulging bag of water. This happened, and it crushed me. Another proposed phraseology that I personally tend to prefer and feel like I'm aiming for is the idea of work-life control, as I've mostly heard referred to by Dr. Sasha Shilkut, who's a cardiac anesthesiologist. We experience increased well-being when we maintain control over whether to ramp up or shift down whatever activities we're involved in, whether in work or in the rest of life. When I am the one asking the scheduler to add a patient in at the end of the day, or to double book them because I know that I just need to check whether the Lasix is working, it feels very different than when it happens to me without my consent. When I am the one who agreed to do 110 hours in 1 week at my hospital in rural Colorado, and know that the next week I'll be able to rest, it feels very different than knowing that I'm going to have to go back and do it again the next week. When I'm the one who agreed to perform an asylum evaluation on Monday and speak at a grand rounds on Thursday and finish my affidavit by Friday, I know that I chose that myself and that next week I will allow myself some recovery time. When I have a sense of control, of agency, most of the time I still load up my schedule with things that I'm particularly passionate about, but I know better than other people where to fit those pieces in. Much better than some random scheduler outside of my life. This, along the fact that I feel like I'm doing meaningful work, is the difference. Ultimately, though, I think that what feels most renewing for each individual is going to be different compared to other people, depending on their personality or life circumstances. And those life circumstances will probably change as our lives change as well. And what we need will change. So how do we know what works best for us? And how do we get there? First, I think that it is important to believe and know that you have more control than you think. Many of us, over time, and with our exhaustion and a lack of demonstration of other opportunities develop a sense of learned helplessness. That this is just the way it is, and there's nothing that can be done about it. But the truth is that we can change our circumstances. This doesn't necessarily mean that those changes will come without consequences. For example, requesting longer appointment slots might result in a pay cut, but technically, we do have options. When we are feeling especially stuck, taking time to define our core values can help us regain a sense of clarity about what really matters to us. There are a lot of core values lists that are floating around on the internet. Find one and ponder it. Most people recommend identifying between 2 and 5 core values, so this may take some time. And the idea between 2 and 5 is that if you have 10 of them, then how can you really focus on any of them? This is a neutral exercise. There's no wrong answer as long as you are being honest with yourself. Next, in detail, imagine your ideal life right now in a way that integrates your core values. You may need to account for variables that you don't feel you have control over, but in reality, you do still choose how to respond to them according to your values. Technically, having an ailing family member doesn't mean that you have to take care of them, but if that is a core value to you, you will find a way to do it. Do you have a baby that you want to watch grow up, or a high schooler whose volleyball games or band concerts you want to go to? Technically, you don't have to go, but if family is a core value to you, then it will be something that's important for you to integrate. Are you single, trying to find time to date? Do you value deep connections with patients? Do you prefer to work really intense blocks of time and then to be away for a while? Let your imagination run wild. I think that many of us have a difficult time dreaming because we're stuck in what reality is now. We can't pursue a life better suited for us until we have an idea about what it might look like. And know your BATNA. This is your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. When you are going to propose something to, especially for those of us that mostly work in employment situations, when you're going to propose to someone that has control over you, it helps to have backup plans, especially financially, especially for those of us with families or with a large amount of student loans. Knowing that you have a backup plan helps to provide the courage to do some of the experimenting. And let it be an experiment. There is no rule that says a change must be permanent in every case, and that whatever you decide to try today, you have to commit to it until the end of time. I got so caught up in this thinking I needed to decide what to do for the rest of my life, and that is nonsense. This doesn't guarantee that there won't be consequences, but when we're willing to think of a change as an experiment, this can take some of the pressure off. It's okay to change our minds. Why do we really think that we have to be exactly what we thought we were going to be 5 or 10 or 20 years ago? Are we really the same people that we were when we decided to go to medical school? Of course not. Or at least hopefully we've matured and grown and learned more about ourselves. And I think it's a beautiful thing to discover our gifts and explore how we can use them to make the world a better place. Can we really say it's better for someone to stay committed in a job that we feel stifled in, rather than letting our gifts truly bloom in the world? For this last section, we are going to spend a little bit of time talking about how systems can better support the people that work within them. Now, living in Arizona, I don't know a whole lot about what the culture at Seattle Children's is, but I'm going to guess that it's similarly awkward to talk about it, just like it is everywhere else. Some of this is going to sound idealistic and be hard to imagine, but I ask you to briefly suspend the disbelief for a little bit. There's still no magic pill. There's no single thing that is going to revolutionize the way things are. Let's just allow our minds to consider every possibility. First and foremost, we must admit that what we're doing isn't working. Some would even argue that it never really did. It just bumbled along, surviving because the social norms of the day allowed it to. There are members of our medical world that lament about the work ethic of today's younger doctors, saying that they should have known what they were signing up for when they went to medical school. Never mind that the qualities that make a good medical student don't necessarily seamlessly translate to what becomes an excellent physician. I found this opinion not infrequently written in the comments of my article on doximity, and that today's residents and younger attendings would never have survived in the intensity of training in years gone by. Whether or not this is objectively true is not in the scope of this lecture. And additionally, I would argue, in many ways, it doesn't even matter. We collectively can wax poetic about all the ways that things were or weren't better in the olden days, but the fact of the matter is, people are still leaving, now, in droves. The system isn't working, and if we still want to have people left to take care of us or our loved ones when we're sick, we need to admit that it's not working, suck it up, and figure out what to do. I would argue that absolutely integral to this concept is to acknowledge that healthcare workers are humans just like patients, with their own unique needs and life situations. Maybe our brains or bodies work differently than other people's, but we're still excellent doctors. We just need more time or different accommodations to complete the work. Maybe our strong preference is to have a certain amount of time with a patient, some longer, some shorter. Maybe there are life changes, taking care of an ailing family member or juggling children, that if we could just adjust expectations for productive work for a time, maybe even years, we might be able to nurture that person through to continue on in the workforce. For those that argue that it is too complicated, I ask, is the alternative of continued burnout and provider loss due to burnout and moral injury really preferable to offering tiers of productivity and compensation for people to choose what they can handle at a given time? Next, involving stakeholders in decision-making. In the words of Dr. Margaret Wheatley, who has spent her life working to create organizations and communities worthy of human habitation, any group can benefit from others' experience and from experts, but the final measures need to be their own creation. People will only support what they create, and those closest to the work know a great deal about what is significant to measure. Workflow changes, scheduling decisions, whether to open to new patients, what size a patient panel should be, nurse staffing ratios. If an organization truly values its workforce, then the opportunity for feedback on any change that involves those people should be given prior to the change and at regular intervals after. Does that sound like too much work? Consider that getting the viewpoints of people actively involved in the work may actually save a lot of hassle in the long run because you've been able to identify at least a few of the points that would have caused a lot of chaos. And people just want to feel heard. They want to feel heard and like their words matter. Use caution when scaling an idea. Just because something worked beautifully somewhere else doesn't mean that it's going to integrate well into your system. As one example, acknowledge that not all patient populations are the same, and some will have specific needs, whether dealing with medically complex patients or language barriers requiring interpretation services, or poor health literacy requiring multiple iterations of explanations. Clinicians that work primarily with complicated patients risk sacrificing safety when they are forced to churn through the same number of appointments as those who see straightforward and healthy people. And finally, an overarching principle that can help make all the other things happen, and perhaps the most lofty, actually definitely the most lofty, that we start with work-life balance or integration or control, whatever your preferred phraseology is, as the end goal, not as a way to enable unsustainable practices to continue. To honor the humanity of a workforce may result in less profit, and we all know that's why it doesn't happen. But let's imagine for a little bit, for too long, the onus of work-life balance has fallen on the worker rather than the system, making it a personal failure if they struggle with the ever-increasing demands placed on them rather than as a failure of the system itself. When we talk about sustainability, we should think carefully about what it is that we actually want to sustain. For example, rather than beginning with, you need to generate X number of RVUs to work here and earn X salary, and then leave it up to the employee to figure out how to juggle the rest of life. What could it look like to say, given your situation, what do you think you can handle right now? Help us understand what would be sustainable for you, and then we can talk about what that would mean for relative compensation. And then there's a conversation about what makes sense. But unfortunately, it anecdotally, at least, feels like the assumption that many systems have is that healthcare workers want to do as little work as they can and get away with it, and therefore treat them with the proportionate suspicion. I believe, though, that a healthy workforce will be more productive and will approach their work with more mindfulness and energy, resulting in better retention and patient care. A former coworker has given me permission to tell her story as an example of what happens when we don't account for important life situations. She began her work only a year ago, and like me, she was convinced that it was her dream job, her calling, to do full-scope rural medicine. Then she had a baby earlier this year, after years of trying and eventually succeeding through assisted reproductive technology. She had a lovely maternity leave, but on returning immediately to full-time work, the demands of 60-hour weeks have become too much. The time away from her daughter, and the sense that she's missing out on an incredibly precious time in her life that she has yearned for years, has her considering whether medicine is even right for her anymore. Why, I ask you, is this excellent doctor being forced to choose between her family and what she considered a calling? How have we not come up with a way to allow these identities to coexist? This is not her fault, and at its core, it isn't even the fault of the clinic that she works for. They are only desperately trying to keep the lights on in the setting of tragically poor reimbursement for primary care. No, her unfortunately not uncommon situation is the result of a larger, unyielding, inflexible, stubborn, and outdated system that is not adapting to the changing needs of its workforce. And we know that what doesn't adapt will die. Does everything we talked about sound too idealistic? And if so, why? If it sounds impossible, what does that say about the healthcare system, who purportedly is trying to promote the health and well-being of our patients? Unfortunately, in my opinion, so much of the wellness conversation revolves around personal characteristics that may enable a person to function like that pathetic sink we saw at the beginning, in a deeply flawed system, rather than speaking out loud the reasons that the system is allowed to remain broken. How grim. And someone once told me that it's only broken if you think its purpose is to provide health care. On my cynical days, it sounds about right. Just because we have always done it one way doesn't mean that we are fated to continue it this way. I believe in us. I believe in our passion and our goodness and our creativity to come up with a solution if we want to do it. I think that if we believe that we begin with the end in mind, as Dr. Stephen Covey puts it, we can create a system that not only cares terrifically for patients, but also remains financially solvent while managing to honor the humanity of its workforce. Until that happens, it will continue to feel like a battle, where healthcare workers are expected to do more with less and always approach their work in a way that protects themselves. But if we start from the desired future of we have a happy, fulfilled, balanced workforce, well-staffed, that is excited to come to work each day and pour themselves out for their patients, and we truly are willing to consider all possibilities, then we can begin imagining what it was that we did as a system to get there. And if we can figure out how to do this better, even as the craziness of healthcare continues to feel like herding cats, which I think it will, I bet that we'll collectively be able to take a big breath and, in the words of that impassioned cat herder that we just watched, say, there ain't a feeling like it in the world. That's all. Thank you all.
Thank you. That was wonderful and really important for all of us. I'll open things up to the room to see if you have any questions, and if you're online, please feel to type away in the chat. Okay, from Lanessa Bass. Thank you for sharing your story and for your authenticity. Do you have any suggestions or thoughts on how we can help trainees to mitigate the burnout during training, and how to help them evaluate their values in finding their first post-training position?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the question. The interesting bit about how do we medicate the trainees. Well, someone once suggested to me that maybe I just needed to take SSRIs and then I could see more patients. So let's not go that way. That is a good question, and I think that this has been part of the conversation of the tension of how do we train our trainees enough, get them enough experience while we're still acknowledging that we're trying to take care of them as humans. And this is definitely not a simple question. And I think that the way that it starts is to acknowledge that residency and the learning curve is very tough. It just is. To go from medical school into actually being the one that signs the orders. I remember the first time I put in an order for Tylenol, and that was a big deal. I think that finding ways to help people know that they're not alone is the place to start. That acknowledging that what they're doing is hard, and not putting people down when they say that they are struggling. This is in 5 minutes, we can't discuss how to develop a curriculum that adequately trains people while still getting the training that they need. But I think that acknowledging that this is a core that we need to be working at, and engaging residents in the conversation is ultimately the most important thing. And being able to have everyone with a stake in the conversation, acknowledging that we have to meet ACGME requirements and all those types of things. I think that when we include residents in those conversations, then it makes more sense. And they're smart. They got here, and I bet they can come up with ways to make it work. And I think that's part of it. Treat them as a team, and trust that they'll be able to help come up with something as well.
Thank you. I have a lot of comments coming in from the online providers. And if you have a question in here, please raise your hand so I can see you. From Sahar Rahulamini, thank you for sharing your journey openly and challenging us to rethink existing systems and expectations. Centering our humanity is key. I'm curious how you approach issues of burnout and workload with the lens of the different privileges one has as a physician. What is the distinction between something very difficult and something oppressive, especially when in service of others who don't share our privileges?
That is a good question as well. I think that acknowledging that we have privilege is the first step. And even for my own self, by making the choice to leave my job and go from a salary of a normal attending physician to something less than a resident for this year, that in and of itself was a privilege, because I had the ability to create an emergency fund, something that I could draw from during the year. Again, I don't think that this is something that we can necessarily easily offload our privilege, but being able to use the privileges that we have to help buffer other people that may not have the same types of privileges can be an important part in building community. Just because we think it's ours doesn't mean that it necessarily is. And when we see someone else encountering some type of setback that we ourselves are not encountering, we can contemplate whether or not there are ways that we can share in the burden of shouldering that privilege, even if it is not something that we can truly assume on our own.
Thank you. And I'll end with these two excellent comments from our online participants. As I'm listening to this talk, I feel like I could take off for the day and find a quiet place to unload what's in my head and heart to figure out what's next. Thank you for reaching out to the rawest part of the heart. And then thank you, Dr. Troyer. This was spectacular, and I appreciate your sharing your voice on this topic. Totally agree. Thank you so much, Dr. Troyer, for being here. For our whole audience today, we have a lot to think about and contemplate. And we'll see you all in 2 weeks, and happy Thanksgiving. Thanks, everybody.